there is a great essay that's in the, yeah, there's something up with the audio where it's not booming in here, except it will distort. And the only challenge is if I do this, it gets really weird. So I appreciate you kind of reining it back in here. There's a great essay in New York Times in the last 10 days that summarized a really cool study that just came out. Researchers in Maryland started working with a variety of landowners in the suburbs who were being the exception in the suburbs by being organic about how they're taking care of their yards. No fertilizers, no pesticides. The difference was half of the yards left their leaves on the ground and the other half did not. And so the researchers went out there and made sure for 2 years that half of them were leaf-free and the other half had leaves on them. And then they would go out into a 1 by 1 meter square area and set up a trap that would catch anything that emerged from the ground. The area that had leaves on it in the course of one spring had 2,000 insects emerge from a 1 by 1 meter square. Okay, that is a huge number of insects. The number was significantly lower in the areas that did not have leaves. If you look at specific types, one of the most impacted ones, the only factoids I'm going to throw at you, is about the moths and butterflies, because I think we've got a lot of fans of those on the island. You would get 45% fewer moths and butterflies by abundance if you get rid of your leaves, and 44% fewer species if you get rid of your leaves. So those two things are pretty staggering, and it's pretty easily explained by the fact that a lot of these animals overwinter as an egg or a larvae, a caterpillar, or as a cocoon in your leaves. And so composting them or shredding them or bagging them up and sending them off is saying goodbye to those insects. It also had a major impact on parasitoid wasps, which I know everybody adores. But when you hear wasp, you think of the yellow-legged hornets and things we're currently worried about. But the vast majority of things when we say wasp or hornet are native things that keep other invertebrates in check. So they lay their eggs on the larvae of other stuff. And most of these are 2 or 3 millimeters long. These are little bitty things that you don't even see with your naked eye. These are great things to have around, and removing the leaves really knocks their numbers back. It's important to think of leaves as year-round habitat. Now the work that was done was in Maryland. Here we know that leaves are year-round habitat because they drop 12 months out of the year. We have live oak, water oak, laurel oak, all dropping leaves throughout the year and especially in March. But when those things drop, they are bringing small insects to the ground with them and providing habitat. It also means if you remove all of the leaves, the soils have about 1/4 less carbon stored, which means they are worse at holding on to water. And as you know, living here in Port Royal Sound, we want to keep water on the islands and let it soak through soils instead of flushing out into our salty sound. So we've been hearing this mantra for a while, leave the leaves. This is the first time there's been really strong data supporting this. There's been a general notion, but this is now solid data. So I'll probably get this in the newsletter. We'll put that article, Mark. All right. So tonight, a friend of mine is here to speak. Tom Austin is coming to us from the Edisto Island Open Land Trust. Tom is an avid naturalist. He thoroughly enjoys the splendor of the natural world. His passion was forged through a childhood growing up in the Lowcountry, spending spring catching toads, summer raising box turtles, fall amused by insects, and winter watching birds flocking over his family's land in Meggett, South Carolina. He's a graduate of Clemson with the Wildlife and Fisheries Biology degree. He's currently a regional director for SCAN, which is the South Carolina Association of Naturalists, the group founded by Rudy Mankey. It's $12 to be a member. You get to go on monthly field trips. We've hosted them here. They go all over the state. They're really great. He has published scientific papers on fish, beetles, butterflies, And earlier this year, he published a book called The Flora and Fauna of Edisto Island and the Lowcountry Sea Islands, which features his writing and his photography. Since 2017, he's been with the Edisto Island Open Land Trust, where he's Director of Land Conservation, which means he does a lot. He handles land conservation projects, property management, GIS mapping, conservation easement monitoring, water quality programs, a Sea Island cotton project at the Hutchinson House. He writes a social media series, which is great, and he compiles the Edisto Island Christmas bird count. And tonight he will be talking to us about something that hits very close to home, about the cotton heritage here. So welcome to Tom Austin.
All right, thank you all for having me tonight. If you need me to be louder or quieter with the microphones, just let me know by pointing and yelling, and I'll try to adjust this as we go. But I'm happy to be here with y'all tonight. Thank y'all for the invitation. This is a project that I have been working on at the Land Trust since 2019, and it's one that I did not expect I would be working with Sea Island cotton in my career at a land trust doing land conservation, but here I am today in front of y'all. So first things first, I want to give you a bit of background information about Sea Island cotton, about why my organization is working with it, and about my organization, about Sea Island cotton, and about the project that kind of is the glue that connects this project to the larger overarching work of our organization on Edisto. So, but first, I want to give you a bit more background about myself. Andy gave me a great introduction, but my background is in wildlife and fisheries biology from Clemson University. I'm a professional conservationist and ecologist. I'm also an expert naturalist. I'm currently the database manager for the South Carolina Association of Naturalists and the president of the Carolina Butterfly Society. I'm an independent researcher, published a book, and I'm also an 11th generation Edistonian, which gives me a very deep tie back to the land I work with. I didn't get a choice, you don't have to thank me. So I have a very deep tie to the land that I work to conserve, to the history that I work to interpret. It's not just a passing interest for me, it is something that defines not just the landscape I work in, but who I am as a person. The Edisto Island is who I am. I am made from Edisto. Additionally, I'm also a man of esoteric interests and eclectic hobbies, which is what brings me here today, and kind of how I ended up falling into this position working on this project. What you will note on that prior slide is that I am not a historian, I'm not a farmer, and I'm not a horticulturalist. I am learning and researching about Sea Island cotton as I go. Assuredly, at some point in this presentation, I have gotten something wrong on one of these slides on account of my complete naivety and incompetence. So take what I'm about to tell you with a fistful of salt. Dr. Richard Porche's The Story of Sea Island Cotton that he published in 2005 is really the bedrock of the information I'm presenting you to here today in the first half of this presentation. And if this really piques your interest and is something that you find that you're really interested in, please pick up a copy of that book. I mean, it's 450 pages of dense information about nothing but Sea Island cotton. It is really a tremendous treatise on the subject. I've also pulled in other primary and secondary sources, both historical and modern, to help inform the narrative I'm giving y'all today. But I've not yet included citations on this presentation, or I would have about another 30 slides at the end of it. And I'd also be remiss not to tell you about who my organization is. The Edisto Island Open Land Trust is Edisto Island's local land trust. We were founded in 1994 to preserve the rural quality of life on Edisto Island by protecting our lands, waterways, scenic vistas, and heritage through conservation and education. Essentially what it boils down to is that we work with landowners to help conserve their land through voluntary conservation easements, and also by providing education about natural resource subjects so that people can best manage that land for the benefit of the natural world that we all rely on. Additionally, in part of that, we also run a lot of community conservation programs. Community conservation is just a fancy new buzzword way as of 2018 of saying that you work within a community to handle the issues that they're dealing with, using conservation as a tool to meet those needs. It's something that we've been doing for our entire life, but until 10 years ago, there wasn't a term for it. So it's something that as a hyper-local land trust, we have been really on the forefront of throughout our life. One of those community conservation projects is the Hutchinson House, which you may have heard of. This is a circa 1885 constructed freedman cottage built by Henry Hutchinson on Edisto Island. The land was purchased by his father, Jim Hutchinson, in 1875 through a multi-individual co-op that purchased an entire plantation off the open market and then subdivided it to create homesteads during the Reconstruction era. The property stayed in the family's hands until 2016 when we purchased it. In 1987, they got it listed on the National Historic Register. We bought it in 2016. And then we have been working with the family hand in hand to restore this house back to its original condition. There it is, right down there at the bottom of the screen. That's how it looks. That's about 3 months ago. As of August, we have finally restored the house back to its original 1800 configuration. So it's been a 9-year journey up to this point. Over $1 million invested of grant funding and donations to take the house from a dilapidated state, falling apart, being held together by wisteria and hopes and dreams. Getting this canopy on it, which we did that in the early winter of 2017. The following year, we had 8 inches of snow on Edisto Island. The house would have collapsed like a house of cards had we not done this. Everyone called us crazy for putting a canopy over the house, but it saved it. And then over the course of the last 9 years, we have raised the funds necessary to restore it back to that original condition, and we're hoping to open it up as a kind of a hub for African American history on the island, as well as a living museum and a green space for the whole community to use. In 2019, we purchased 9 acres next to it. We're always interested in trying to expand our footprint and work with the adjacent landowners to try and protect and buffer that property and enhance the public benefit. And like I said, we're finally done with the restoration. I'm sure that we will find many, many more things that we still need to fix, but right now, knock on wood, the house is restored. And so I'd be remiss to talk about the Hutchinson House without also talking about the Hutchinson family, because they really define what the home is, rather than just a place where people live, but really a site of tremendous, dense history on the island. So the patriarch of the family, James Hutchinson, better known as Jim, was a Civil War veteran. He served in the Union Navy. He was a farmer. He was a social activist. He was a politician. He was also a business entrepreneur. He co-founded the first black-owned steamboat company on Edisto Island, which until 1920, there was no landward passage to Edisto Island. All commerce, all people, all goods, all cattle, everything came on and off the island by boat. So by founding his own steamboat company, he developed his own direct access to Charleston Harbor, to the Charleston market. It's his own through line for commerce without having to deal with any of the other middlemen or other prejudices that were being placed on black-owned enterprises at the time. He also organized at least 2 freeman-led co-ops that we know of on the island, where they would purchase an entire plantation off the market or at foreclosure, buy that property, and then everyone who paid into that co-op would then be divided up in interest based off of the share that they contributed. This was a way for him to get land into the hand of farmers during restoration who really were cash-strapped and there was not access to land. They couldn't afford to, pay for the necessities of life, to build a better future for their family, because they didn't have access to that land. So this was a mechanism for them to be able to collectively work to obtain land so that they could become self-sufficient and to forge a better future for their families. Regrettably, James was shot and killed on 4th of July, 1885 by a white man from Guatemala named Jim Barth. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced for manslaughter, and then acquitted a year later by an all-white jury. It's really a sad story and a sad ending for James Hutchinson, but his legacy doesn't end there, because his son, Henry, who was born in 1860, carried on his legacy, but he took it from a different angle. He was an entrepreneur, but not in the same grand sense that his father was. He built an agricultural co-op around Sea Island cotton within his community, around the Hutchinson House, around the gin house that they had purchased on that site and renovated. So by running a co-op, he was able to take 20, 30, 50 farmers who all had 10 to 20 acres of agricultural fields and pool all their resources together, pool all their crops together, gin, process, sort, and ship that cotton through the steamboat company he had an interest in directly to Charleston market, eliminating middlemen, having greatest financial return for the people who were part of the co-op. Then additionally, being a co-op, being a larger entity, he was able to access things like loans and direct contracts with factors who were selling the cotton at the international market. And so through that, he was really able to help elevate not just his own family, but the entire community around him through his agricultural co-op and through the business-minded sense that he inherited from his father. And then the legacy doesn't stop there. Two of Henry's daughters were both school teachers. One of them, Lula Whaley, taught school on Edisto Island for over 55 years. She taught over 3 generations of Edistonians to read and write, all the way up from elementary school learning all the way to middle school, early high school. So she was really a tremendous figure in helping elevate the community on the island and help freedmen, help their families, help their descendants, make better futures for themselves, see a better tomorrow. And then additionally, that legacy continues on today through the Hutchinson Heritage Foundation, which was founded in 2023 to protect, preserve, and interpret the collective history of the Hutchinson family. And so this brings us to the intersection of the Hutchinson House and Sea Island cotton. So Sea Island cotton is really core to the history of Edisto Island, also to Beaufort out here. Everything I'm going to have in this presentation is going to be contextually related back to Edisto Island because that's where I live, that's where I work, but this really applies all throughout the Sea Islands of the Lowcountry, from Charleston Harbor all the way down south to the Savannah. But specifically on Edisto Island, our entire economy revolved around the production of Sea Island cotton for a very long period of time. The profitability of that crop fueled the Lowcountry plantation economy there, and it really set the stage for the Civil War and everything that followed after that. Sea Island cotton was grown here in the Lowcountry for over 150 years. Most folks have only ever heard about that first half of its history, from 1790 till the end of the Civil War in 1865. However, the second half of the story is what I'm here to really highlight for y'all today, what we're trying to highlight through our interpretation at the Hutchinson House, and that's that Sea Island cotton was still grown from 1865 all the way up until 1940 here in the Lowcountry. It was primarily grown in the antebellum period by plantations, by planters in the plantation economy, but following that, it was grown in a very large degree, in fact, on Edisto Island, in majority by independent freedmen farmers growing crops on land that they owned outright. In the story of Henry Hutchinson and Jim Hutchinson, the whole Hutchinson family, since the 1860s, is interwoven with Sea Island cotton as a result. Jim sought economic success for his family and for others during that Reconstruction era through growing Sea Island cotton. Henry's entire livelihood revolved around that, and really the livelihood of the whole community around him was based on that Sea Island cotton co-op that he had built. It's an inseparable piece of the Hutchinson family's history. Something I want to highlight over here is that this up here in the top left, this is the Hutchinson's gin house. Here in the top right, this is Henry Hutchinson. You can see his gin house just peeking through in the background over there, but this is the field of Sea Island cotton that he's standing in. And then Henry was really competing with all of the major plantations during, the early 1900s, early 1900s, start of the 20th century. These are all articles from the Post-Courier at the time, where he is delivering the first bale of extra fine, long staple Sea Island cotton to market year after year after year after year. This is not a small operation he had. He was competing with all of the major plantations in the area. He was getting the first bale of cotton to market. This was a serious operation that he had. And so now that you know the history behind it, how it relates back to the land trust and the work that we're doing, I want to tell you a bit about Sea Island cotton as a plant. So Sea Island cotton is an improved day-neutral flowering cultivar of the tropical and perennial long staple cotton, Gossypium barbadense. Let me unpack that a little bit. So it's a cultivated crop. It's improved. It's not just a wild plant that they're planting. But the important thing I want to point out there is the term day neutral. So Sea Island cotton is a tropical plant, meaning that it looks at photoperiod. It looks at the length of the day. It's got hormonal cues baked into its biochemistry that signal to it, okay, it's fall. I need to start flowering. This is something that's common in tropical plants because down in the tropics, they don't have winter, spring, summer, fall like we do up here. They more so have dry and wet seasons. So long staple cotton is generally a dry season plant, so it relies on photoperiod to determine when it's going to flower. You take it and you plant it up here in South Carolina, it doesn't flower until this time of year. And it takes 2 months for the flowers to mature. What happens within 2 months? We get a hard frost and the plant dies. So if you take wild long staple cotton and you plant it here in the Carolinas, in the Lowcountry, it will never produce a viable crop. If it does produce a crop, it only is producing a crop for maybe a couple weeks before it gets frozen and dies. So this was a factor that early long staple cotton planters had to breed out of the plant, and that's ultimately what led to the creation of Sea Island cotton. It's not so much the fiber characteristics, it was getting this tropical plant to start flowering just as soon as it got big enough. That's day neutrality, and that was critical to the development of Sea Island cotton. Now, peeling back and just looking at long staple cotton, everyone knows about cotton. Everyone has driven through a cotton field somewhere in the Midlands of South Carolina, North Carolina, anywhere in the Southeast. That is upland cotton, Gossypium hirsutum, completely separate species from long staple cotton, and from long staple cotton, Sea Island cotton was developed. So upland cotton, Gossypium hirsutum, the term, the Latin there for the specific epithet, hirsutum, means hairy cotton, when you break down the entire Latin name. And that is really a key characteristic of the plant. When you look at the two together side by side, Sea Island cotton and other long staple cottons are just generally much larger plants. They get, in ideal conditions, 9 or 10 feet tall, as compared to many upland cottons that top out at about 4 to 5 feet tall. They lack hairs on their stem. Again, upland cotton is hairy cotton. Gossypium barbadense is Barbados cotton. It's not hairy. It lacks any kinds of hairs over here on its stems, on its fruits, on its flowers, on its leaves. It has teardrop-shaped fruits. If you look at upland cotton, they have round, spherical fruits. The leaves are generally 5-lobed. Most upland cottons, the sort of newer leaves on the outer ends of the branches are typically 3-lobed, sometimes with faint 5 lobes, almost always 5-lobed in Sea Island and other long staple cottons. It has much longer, finer fibers than upland cotton, which is really the base of the difference between the two as a marketable product, as a marketable crop. Its flowers tend to be yellow, usually this nice pastel yellow. Upland cottons tend to be white or pink. It's very picky about its climate and soil. As a tropical plant, it really needs tropical conditions or subtropical conditions like we have down here. It thrives in high humidity, high heat, and it really likes well-drained, young, sandy soils, like they have abundantly in the coastal areas of the tropics or in the Caribbean, and that we have a lot of here on the Sea Islands. That's something that upland cotton isn't so picky about. Additionally, its seeds are very different. They're black, they're hard, they're shiny, and they don't have hairs that cling tightly to them. And that changes how they can be processed as a agricultural crop. That really divides the two plants into two different crops that really have to be handled through two entirely different markets. Sea Island cotton thrives in the long growing seasons we have here, and also our young sandy soils are highly fertile compared to older clay soils towards the Midlands, and the subtropical climate we have here, the not as hot hots, but also the relatively warm winters, lengthen the growing season we have, and they reduce the stresses on the plant, and this is where Sea Island cotton thrives. So it really was not grown much in South Carolina outside the Sea Islands. That was due to a combination of factors, not just because of its propensities towards subtropical conditions and young soils, but also just because, lost my train of thought there. I don't know where I was going with that. That one completely left me. We'll move on. So anyway, looking at the product itself, Sea Island cotton fibers generally were about twice as long and about twice as fine as those of upland cottons during, the peak of Sea Island cotton cultivation. Nowadays, upland cottons have been able to really push the envelope of what they're able to do, but they still have never gotten anywhere near the fineness and the length of fibers that you see in even heirloom Sea Island cottons like what I'm growing. But at the same time, those longer, finer fibers still retain the same tensile strength. You've got the same quantity of fiber. So you're thinking about, rather than working with a 3/4 inch fiber with let's say a cross-sectional area of 2, you're now working with fiber that's twice as long with a cross-sectional area of 1. Really, the strength of the fiber comes from how those fibers interlock together. You're usually not breaking fibers when a thread breaks. The fibers are slipping past each other. So you have pretty much double the surface area with an even finer fiber, and this allowed for Sea Island cotton to be spun into incredibly fine, remarkably strong fibers. And with that, it was prized by the royalty and the nobility of England, Europe, France, for master weavers and master spinners to make some of the finest laces and muslins that were humanly possible to make during the period. But at the same time, Sea Island cotton also had a number of practical uses, especially during the Industrial Revolution. It was used in the first bias-ply tires, the first parachute cords. It sewed together some of the earliest hot air balloons, as well as it sewed together airplane skins. And it was used in high RPM drive belts and machinery, which you could have a belt that was half the weight, which means that you could spin it twice as fast. You didn't have that same amount of momentum. It allowed it to be used in much finer, more highly engineered machinery. And so it wasn't just a crop that was used to, clothe the Queen of England. It did have a wide suite of practical purposes and helped push the envelope when it came to really early industrialization, across the world. And now peeling back and looking at the crop kind of holistically as a crop, as a cash crop, in the antebellum, Sea Island cotton was grown at the plantation scale, and it was the dominant crop here in the Lowcountry. I should caveat that with on the uplands. In the lowlands, especially in brackish marshes, freshwater marshes, and inland swamps, rice was the dominant crop. But if there was upland acreage where you couldn't grow rice, it was in Sea Island cotton, period, end of discussion. I mean, if it could grow Sea Island cotton, it had Sea Island cotton. If it didn't, you found something else you could put on it. Almost using Edisto Island as context, almost every single acre of the island was in cotton production in 1850s. We're a tidally locked island. We don't, much like it is around here in Beaufort. We had very little freshwater input. There was very little tidally managed rice. There were a few inland rice impoundments in blackwater swamps, but for the most part, well over 60% of the island, excluding 60% of the island gross. And that's with 40% of that being salt marsh, was Sea Island cotton fields. Almost every single freshwater wetland that could be drained was drained. It was ditched, it was diked, and it was put into Sea Island cotton cultivation. Thousands of acres of high salt marsh were also diked, desalinated, and converted into cotton fields. Much of the high salt marshes you see around the Lowcountry, if you ever look out into the marsh and you see odd lines, or you see slight bumps or rises, or you see cedar trees in a straight line somewhere, that was probably the outside field line of the Sea Island cotton field. We've had about a foot of sea level rise over the last 100 years, and so that really obscures a lot of that old cotton infrastructure that's out there in the landscape, but there were much wider areas of cotton cultivation in this landscape that really have become hidden behind seas of spartina and black needle rush. Sea Island cotton was generally harvested starting in August, and it went all the way through into December until the first frost. It's not like modern cotton cultivation where they can go out, plant it, wait until a set period of time, spray it with herbicide, come out and harvest it with big lint rollers. The cotton was picked by hand for months on end until the frost came through, froze the plants, and then the developing bolls could no longer mature, so the cotton that was being harvested was no longer of marketable quality. So it was generally 4 to 5 months of continuous cotton picking that happened with the Sea Island cotton crop. And then additionally, you had to go through multiple stages of processing before it was actually a marketable crop. It wasn't just pick it out the plant, put it in a bag, and sell it. On the plantation, on the homestead, wherever the cotton was being processed, it had to be dried to get rid of natural moisture that was in the plant, as well as to drive some of that latent humidity out of the plants. And you're picking things in August, I mean, come on. They had to be sorted as well, which was going through and doing the initial processing and cleaning of it. Then they had to whip the cotton. They had to fluff up the cotton, because Sea Island cotton really clings tightly to the seed. It doesn't fluff up and burst into a cotton ball like you see in upland cotton. Since the fibers are so much longer, they're so much smaller, they don't uncoil like they do in upland cotton. They stay tight knit. So those fibers have to be fluffed up, and they have to be cleaned during that process in order to prepare them for ginning, which is where the seeds are mechanically removed from the fiber. Then after that, that fiber has to then be cleaned in order to remove any stained lint, any damaged materials, sticks, leaves, anything that got through it. And then at that point, it can finally be packed in waterproof bags and then shipped to the market. And so all of those steps have to be gone through before a marketable crop is actually produced. So it was a very labor-intensive crop, but at the very least, Sea Island cotton was not a perishable good. So these things could be done during the down season. Generally, cotton was grown, cultivated throughout the spring, harvested throughout the summer and in fall, and then processed during the winter. And then the fields prepped again the following spring. Additionally, Sea Island cotton had to be ginned on a roller gin, which was a far more ancient, much more simple kind of gin. It might look like something like that over there. And that delicately pulls the fiber from the seed. Because this is a much longer, finer fiber, it can't deal with the rough handling that comes with the saw gin, and I'll talk about that in a second, which is what was used to cultivate or to process upland cottons. So after that packed cotton was shipped, it was delivered to a factor. So a factor kind of acted as both a broker, a lender, a banker, and they gained the worldwide market for cotton to maximize their profit. So they would pay the planters, and this goes back to the antebellum period. It wasn't just during sharecropping or post-war. All the planters worked with the factor. They would sell their cotton at a predetermined price in order to pay off their note that they had borrowed for the year, and that factor would buy off any additional bales of cotton they were able to deliver beyond what they had promised at a set price or some negotiated price. Then that factor would sit on that cotton in a warehouse and try and gain the worldwide market on cotton to maximize their profit. Cotton is not a perishable good, so it could sit in a warehouse for multiple years if they needed to, trying to maximize what they're doing. So the factors and planters had a symbiotic relationship. The planters could get whatever they needed at the start of the year to run the farm throughout the year, and then the factor could make their money taking risk and trying to analyze the market and ship overseas. So, also want to talk about a pet peeve I have. So everyone learns in school that Eli Whitney invented the singular cotton gin, the only one that ever existed. That is incorrect. He invented a cotton gin, one type of cotton gin. That is the saw gin, which is what is shown down here. How the saw gin works is it's more or less, it's a series of saw blades that are all stacked together. And those blades pull through the cotton fibers, and they go through a comb. And so they grab the fibers, pull them through the comb, and shoot the fibers out the other side, and all the seeds get stuck behind because they're too small to go through the slots in the comb. However, if you put Sea Island cotton into one of that, it grabs the fiber, rips it in half, and spits it out the other side. You have the world's most expensive upland cotton that you can't sell to anybody for any price. So Sea Island cotton was never ginned on the saw gin, and the saw gin's development, its invention, was completely immaterial and unrelated to anything that ever had anything to do with Sea Island cotton. The two crops actually were developed in parallel, and Sea Island cotton just barely made it into the plantation cash crop scene just 2 or 3 years before the saw gin was invented, patented, and started to be sold. So if the saw gin had been invented 3 years prior, or if it had taken an additional 3 years for Sea Island cotton to be developed, it may have never existed. So the saw gin was absolutely critical for processing upland cotton, because upland cotton has a very small, soft seed that has fibers coming out of it from every angle, and those fibers can cling tightly to the seed. You try and feed it into a roller gin, it just smashes the seed and spits it out the other end. It doesn't actually process the fiber, which is why the saw gin revolutionized and created the entire market for upland cotton. However, at the same time, the roller gin had been developed in India about sometime between 500 and 1300 AD. It had made its way over to the colonies and to the Caribbean, in the 1600s and the very early 1700s, but there was just not really anything they could process with it. They didn't have a cotton crop that could, utilize a roller gin, and an upland cotton, which is native or endemic to Central America, grew really well, but they just didn't have a way to process it. So you had a gin that didn't have cotton, and you had cotton that didn't have a gin. And Sea Island cotton was developed from long staple cotton, which came from South America, and indigenous peoples had also brought it to the Caribbean and improved it, and increased its yield, increased its fiber characteristics. But colonists really turned it into an annual row crop kind of plant. It was eventually brought, I'm getting ahead of myself, I have a whole slide on this after this one. Anyway, I'll just keep going. Eventually brought it to the Americas and were able to make it day neutral, create it into a row crop plant, and then that allowed them to use the saw gin to process it. And that happened in 1790, I believe, was the first time a marketable crop was made with a long staple cotton here in the Carolinas. And then in 1893, the saw gin was invented. So anyway, that's what I just said about the whole crop being perfected in 1790. So it was brought, it's believed that it originated from a cultivar brought from the Caribbean. And then the crop was really, that day neutrality was first beat into it in the Sea Islands of Georgia. But then in the early, I think actually 1790 itself, it was brought to the Sea Islands of South Carolina. And then over the course of the next About 30 years or so, it was perfected on primarily Edisto Island and Johns Island. There were many planters experimenting with it in parallel at the same time, and they were all competing with each other to create a marketable crop. And then after they had figured that out, and everyone figured out their secret, which was that you just use the cotton from the plants that did the best, and then that usually results in the best looking cotton in the next year's crop. It's called seed selection. No one thought to try that, apparently. After everyone else figured out the secret, got their hands on improved cultivars, there was a gold rush-like scramble in the early part of the 1800s, where every single arable acre of land on the Sea Islands was converted into Sea Island cotton cultivation. Hundreds of plantations sprang up just in a matter of a few decades. Really early cultivation focused on creating the most supreme fiber quality to compete for the highest end of the market, to get the highest dollar per bale. But after several planters had really cemented their place, developed a brand, cemented their place in the market, and developed a really, a high quality fiber that just no one else was really able to touch, everyone started competing for higher volume versus that higher quality. The high quality markets had kind of been pinned down by a few individual planters. The market began to saturate. The focus was on yield. Early agricultural bulletins I've been able to find indicate that there was an inverse relationship between fiber fineness and length and fiber yield. Anytime a planter tried to increase yield, they always lost fiber fineness. They were usually able to keep some of that length intact, and so people diversified and they picked one market they wanted to compete in. Did they want to make super fine cotton, or did they just want to maximize their profits? In the Civil War, Sea Island cotton production basically ceased in the Lowcountry. There was some minimal production at plantations here and there, but for the most part, it was more beyond than decimated between the prior years. However, following the Civil War, Sea Island cotton continued to be grown extensively on the Sea Islands. And it was grown a lot under the plantation sharecropping system, but on a lot of places, especially Edisto Island, it was grown extensively by independent freedmen farmers who owned their own land and were growing their cotton for their own benefit. Then additionally, in the late 1800s, the Sea Island cotton market really started to wane as Egypt had gotten their hands on Sea Island cotton and began to create their own hybrids and cultivars, which eventually became known as Egyptian cottons, all of which are descended directly from the Sea Island cottons that we had here in the Carolinas. And so since they essentially still had slave labor in Egypt, they were able to cut the bottom of the market out piece by piece by piece, year after year. And so they were really competing with the same market as freedmen farmers who had to ship that cotton a much farther distance over to Europe, and were competing kind of at that lower end bucket of the market. And so the margins were much thinner in the Americas versus over here, even though the Americans had a superior product. And so the market slowly started to shift away from the southern United States for long staple cottons. Then the boll weevil showed up right in the middle of that. So the boll weevil is a little quarter-inch size beetle that looks about like that, according to the USDA. And it's a species that's native to Central America. It is naturally adapted to feed on and parasitize cotton plants. It lays its eggs on the developing fruits of those cotton plants, and it feeds on the developing seeds and fibers within those fruits. This really doesn't hurt the plant from, most of these are perennial plants that live for multiple years. It damages their reproductive output, but it really doesn't impact the health of the plant. However, if you're growing specifically the fiber, which is attached to the seed, it absolutely obliterates your yields. And so the boll weevil was a plague upon the southern economy when it arrived. It arrived here in Beaufort and Edisto Island about 1918, and it managed to cross the Rio Grande Valley down there in about the 1890s, and within 30 years, it was throughout the entirety of the Cotton Belt. So in the span of 3 decades, the entire cotton economy in the southern United States collapsed in on itself, which was the staple cash crop for the entirety of this area. So the impact that the boll weevil had on the southern economy cannot be understated. And it was the final death nail for Sea Island cotton, for the most part. Just because it was a really high-end luxury product that they were producing, it could not tolerate the impacts of the boll weevil. In the They were already being stressed to the breaking point for most Sea Island cotton farmers by that competing Egyptian market. And so by the 1920s, everyone had pretty much given up on it. In the 1930s, the USDA tried to restart the Sea Island cotton market by moving it more inland into southern Georgia and northern Florida. But that issue ultimately failed, not just because of the boll weevil, but due to the logistics of having to grow two cotton crops on the landscape. Long staple cotton and upland cotton will hybridize, so if you have the two plants planted in fields right next to each other, the plants on the margins will hybridize, and so those seeds will get mixed into the next year's crop, and then both farmers will end up with an inferior product, because generally when you have random hybrids, they don't result in a perfect 50-50 mix of things. It's a completely random assemblage of genes. And then additionally, even if you were the only person planting cotton anywhere within a mile of yourself, there was only one gin on the landscape. If it was a saw gin, you were taking your Sea Island cotton to a saw gin and it was ruining your cotton fibers. And then even if it was a roller gin, if you were taking your Sea Island cotton to a roller gin, someone with upland cotton probably brought it there as well. And so seeds were getting mixed in here and there was just not a way to keep the two crops separate on the same landscape. The reason why Sea Island cotton was able to work here on the Sea Islands is because they're islands. Anyone who was on the Sea Island and had cotton land wasn't growing to go upland cotton because they got a massive premium on Sea Island cotton. But if you tried to grow the two crops in the same landscape, it would really impact everyone in the same area. So they had naturally segregated themselves as crops upon the landscape historically, which is why it didn't work when Sea Island cotton was brought into the interior mainland and the subtropical regions of the southern United States. Not because it couldn't grow, not because it couldn't be cultivated, but just because the logistics, the infrastructure in place couldn't sustain it. After that 1930s effort failed, the USDA tried again in the mid to late 1930s at the PD Research Station in Florence, South Carolina to breed boll weevil resistant strains of Sea Island cotton. They gave up on that effort in 1930 because Florence really was not the ideal climate to be growing Sea Island cotton. They moved down to Johns Island and tried working on hybrids. They closed up that project in 1942 and then moved over to the Midlands of Georgia to try and introduce Sea Island cotton genes into upland cotton to improve the upland cotton crop so that they could, even if they were still dealing with the stresses of the boll weevil, they could have a superior crop with more boll weevil resistance, but they could still try and keep the market alive. Those efforts were eventually successful after many, many, many decades. However, the real thing that really succeeded in preserving cotton as a crop is that in the late 1970s, the USDA launched their boll weevil eradication program, which is a very simple program. In essence, they simply told everyone in an area to stop growing cotton. And then they would go out, remove any rogue plants, feral plants growing in ditches or tree lines anywhere on the landscape, and keep it like that for a series of years, usually 3 to 5 years or more. And then at that point, all of the boll weevils living on the landscape, they can only eat cotton, and cotton is not native to the US, so they have nothing to host on. So after a certain number of years, all the boll weevils would be dead, and then you could replant cotton, and it would be a boll weevil-free area. So they systematically did this across the entire southern coastline, and then by 2009, they had eradicated the boll weevils from the United States, except for southern Texas. And that's still how it is today. Every once in a while, we'll get stuck in a grill from somebody coming up out of Mexico and escapes into a field. But that's why the USDA puts boll weevil monitoring traps in every commercial cotton field in the United States. It's additionally why they require me to have a permit to grow ornamental Sea Island cotton. The big thing here is that after the USDA quit growing Sea Island cotton in the 1940s, the cultivation of any pure original pedigree of Sea Island cotton ceased to exist in the United States. They were the only ones still trying to work with that crop. There might have been folks here or there with yard plants or small plots in their garden, but no one was working on it from a commercial standpoint anymore on the landscape. So I would be remiss to talk about Sea Island cotton without also talking about the consequences that it brought to this landscape. The production of Sea Island cotton, like all plantation cash crops, took an immeasurable toll on the lives of hundreds of thousands of enslaved men and women. Planter efforts to preserve the Sea Island cotton economy centered around Charleston Harbor eventually fueled the events that precipitated the Civil War and brought bloodshed to this land. The Sea Island cotton also left an indelible mark on the geology, on the hydrology, and on the ecology of the Sea Islands. My home on Edisto Island was practically scraped bare of trees. There is an apocryphal tale that you could sit on the porch of Sea Island, or Seabrook Plantation, which is on the north end of the island, and you could look at the ocean 6 miles away because there were no trees between you and the ocean. You don't do that to a landscape for 150 years straight without reaping some kind of consequences to the land. Every tree, every wetland, great expanses of high marsh were converted, tilled over, and damaged irreparably for over 150 years. The landscape that we live in here on the Sea Island, here in the Lowcountry, has been altered by the cultivation of Sea Island cotton. Certain species have been extirpated from the landscape in certain areas. There are things that I find in Beaufort, things that I find in Johns Island that I have never found once on Edisto Island, just because of the intensity of cotton agriculture that we had. Sea Island cotton cultivation left a lasting mark upon all facets of the Lowcountry. Sea Island cotton was a cash crop that was endemic to the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, and that means that it has a really invaluable historical context when we think about this place. It was the most common upland plant on the Sea Islands for over a century. I want that to sink in. The most common plant, not crop, plant. There was more cotton than there was grass on the Sea Islands for over a century. That is absurd to think about. Just think about the number of pine trees we have here. We had 1% of the tree canopy we had back then. All of the Sea Island cotton's economies revolved around the cultivation of this plant. Hundreds of thousands of people spent their entire lives just focused on cultivating this crop. Many enslaved people suffered for it, and many freedmen found prosperity with it. The very ground we walk on here has been turned over countless times in the pursuit of growing this plant. The landscape we live in is still being influenced by that scarring infrastructure, by the dikes out in the marsh, by the ditches out in the wetlands. And then over the span of just a few decades, it just vanished, disappeared from the entire landscape, and has seemingly been forgotten by most folks. I mean, I learned about Sea Island cotton in school, but I had no idea what it looked like. I knew none of this stuff. It's one of those things that just kind of just vanished, and we don't think about it anymore, even though all of these impacts are still here, and we're still carrying them forward to this day. We cannot understand our past here if we don't understand Sea Island cotton. Sea Island cotton is that thread that stitches the long history of the Lowcountry together. With that, I think I'm out of time, but here's the other half of the presentation. So, real quick, we'll try and speed through this real quick. But I'm working with a strain of Sea Island cotton that I was given by a guy in a parking lot in fall of 2018. He said, I've got some of the real Sea Island cotton. I didn't believe him for 1 second. But after I got my hands on it and my boss told me to grow Sea Island cotton, I didn't have a choice. I started doing some research, and I managed to find what I believe to be a smoking gun, that this is in fact real deal, true, genuine Sea Island cotton that we have that we're working with on Edisto Island. Here's the thumbtack on the wall diagram going through that whole train of accession. There's the aforementioned Ziploc bag of seeds I got in the parking lot. But those came from a USDA accession at their cryo storage facility in College Station, Texas, specifically designed to keep and preserve heirloom strains of cotton for agricultural research. This one has the name of Bleak Hall Sea Island. If you know anything about Edisto Island history, you know that Bleak Hall was the largest producer of Sea Island cotton. This is the plantation that was selling directly to the Queen of England for decades. They had the most premium Sea Island cotton fiber. And they were also the world exporter of Sea Island cotton seed. If anyone wanted to buy seed, they weren't maintaining their own strain, they wanted to start up their plantation, they bought seed from Bleak Hall. And if you look over here into this 1974 publication from the USDA from their hybrid cotton program, you notice that they mentioned they have a strain of Bleak Hall Sea Island. And then they stopped doing this research in 1939. If you look over here, this accession started in 1939. This is a USDA accession, so I'm fairly confident that this Bleak Hall strain was taken from Sea Island sometime in the 1920s or 1930s, used for the USDA for back crossing to create hybrids, and then put into this permanent accession in the 1930s. And all of the contextual information they have on this, they told me, is on a handwritten index card in a shoebox in Bill's office, and they don't know when Bill's coming back from vacation. So I don't have any further information on the context behind that, but this is kind of just one of those things that got lost in history. And it took a attorney in downtown Charleston named Bill McLean reading Porche's book 10 years after it was published, reading the line that he had in there saying, sea island cotton is extinct and no more, going, I don't think that's right. And then hopping on Google, finding this, recognizing the Bleak Hall name, taking a chance, and then giving me a Ziploc bag of seeds, and then my crazy self finding all of these other traces that connect it. And then additionally, the USDA folks told me that it was actually used in a genetic study where they mapped the interrelatedness of upland cotton, or modern upland cotton and modern long staple cotton strains. And as you can see, this is my strain down here, Bleak Hall Sea Island. This over here is upland cottons, these over here are long staple cottons. Very much not related, there's this massive gulf between them, so it's not a hybrid. However, this is a three-dimensional axis, and if you notice, this is very much all the way in the corner, far away from everything else, and all of these over here are Egyptian cottons and Pima cottons. Now, Egyptian cottons, as I mentioned previously, are direct descendants from Sea Island cottons, likely probably Bleak Hall cotton, because that's what they could buy and get imported to Egypt. And all of the modern Pima cottons that are grown in the Southwest are direct descendants of Egyptian cottons. So, I'm not a geneticist, but this is pretty good evidence that it is not an upland cotton hybrid that has just been put into a session for some reason, like most things labeled sea island cotton are. But this is probably the real deal, probably from the original direct source acquired by the USDA and maintained by the USDA for seed purity. That's all that I just said. So in 2019, I started my project. Let me see. I did a lot of very high-tech work. It's all my fertilizer that I used, crushed up dental models and roach killer palm fertilizer, because I had really good soil and I didn't actually have to do all that much. There's my irrigation. Don't do that. Get a well. But by golly, the seeds grew and I put them in the ground. And I ended up with the fluffy white stuff at the end of the year, which was my ultimate goal. I just wanted to not kill the plants and get some cotton fiber at the end of the year. And here's the development of the plants and the crops going throughout the whole month until I eventually ended up in my first open pulls at the very end of August of 2019. There's the actual fibers themselves. I did measure them. They came in at 1 inch and 9/16, which categorizes them on the far upper end of extra fine long staple cotton. I didn't look at them under a microscope. I even compared them to upland cotton. They are in fact twice as fine. They are in fact twice as long. And here it is, the actual fiber itself. So y'all pass some of these around and just feel it, because this is something I want y'all to really experience. Well, actually, I have a microphone. Yes.
How old were the seeds that you found that you used?
So the seeds that I got came directly from Bill, who got it from the USDA. The USDA folks update their accessions every 10 years. And, please give this back to me. I don't have a lot of cotton. Please don't steal it. But what I want you to do is feel that cotton. And we've all felt a cotton ball. And what I want you to know is that a cotton ball is essentially cotton fiber that they pulled the seed out of and stuck in a bag and sold you for a markup of about 100%. This is cotton that all I did was pull the seed out of it and just feel the softness, feel the fineness, feel the silky quality of it. That is the difference with Sea Island cotton that drove it to such a market height, that created such a frenzy behind that crop. It is a completely separate beast from upland cotton. And so when I had this stuff ginned, I knew I was working with the real deal. This is something different. This is something special. I ran into a lot of difficulties in 2019. It turns out working with an heirloom cotton crop that no one has grown in 80 years, and no one who is alive today knows anyone who is ever alive who has ever grown it, means that there's not a lot of information out there on how to grow it. So I had various issues. The biggest issue I have, and have had a chronic issue with, is bull rot. I thought it was a nutritional deficiency, but it turns out it's stink bugs. So historically, I can find no accounts of stink bugs, so I think that these are actually an invasive pest that has brought a new form of bacterial bull rot to the cotton belt. So this is something I'm having to figure out, and the way that you fix it is with parasitoid wasps. So shout out to leaving your leaves. So anyway, so that's an issue I'm still trying to deal with. I've actually had a bumper crop this year. I just hope I'm going to have the time to be able to pick it. They're very resilient to hurricanes. I had a hurricane come through and I lost like 3 leaves and 1 plant leaned over, and that was it. It was crazy. I took a lot of data in 2019. I was very particular because I thought I was going to have 1 shot before everything died or I had a hurricane come through and destroy it. But I learned a lot that first year, and I'm glad I did it. I stopped doing it after that because I was out there like twice a week taking data. I was measuring every single plant with a tape measure. Don't recommend that. But now I have a very good baseline of what I can work with in my crop. It takes about 17 days on average for a seed to germinate, about 100 days for that seed from going in the ground to flower. And then after a plant flowers, it takes about 56 days, about 7 weeks for that flower to turn into a fruit, fully grow, fully mature, open, and be harvestable. Another problem I ran into is the fact that no one makes double roller cotton gins anymore. No one grows Sea Island cotton anymore. So I had to build my own cotton gin from reverse engineering patent drawings from the French archives. That's one of the results over there sitting on the mantle. But the primary gin that I have, which I still need to make a ton of improvements to, is this one, which is on a sewing machine treadle and is some custom rollers I had a guy make, and he didn't make them very right, so I had to remake them with Chinese gears I got on eBay and a pulley, and it works.
Use a rolling pin.
I tried that. They're not concentric. That was Mark 1. And so here's the real proof in the pudding. If you just feed the cotton right in there, the fiber goes in, the seeds fall right off. That's the beauty of a double roller gin and ginning long staple cotton. If your rollers are polished, you don't pinch your finger in there. If they're not, you do.
So then are those seeds you can use again?
Yep. So those seeds are pretty much clean. I generally try and get some of the extra lint off of them. Industrially, they clean the lint off by dipping them in sulfuric acid for a couple of seconds. I just haven't done that. Not worth the effort. But there's the gin cotton. I don't have to do much more than that to go through and pick off any broken seeds or lint. That's exactly what it If you yourself find yourself in a position where you need to gin your own Sea Island cotton because you're growing an heirloom crop, I did make a design for how to make one that you could run by hand. It just takes a 2x4 dowels, some gears, and a little bit of woodworking experience. I've got that on our website at the Land Trust. And then, yeah, I've been growing it out for several years. One thing I do want to cover before Andy hits me with the shepherd's hook is that spinning, weaving, and working with textiles is something that we have not had the capacity to do. Sea Island cotton, as I mentioned, took some master weavers and spinners who worked their entire lives in a trade to be able to really eke out the actual full character of the crop. So that is not something I can do in my spare time after work. So eventually at some point I would love to have a partnership with a really high-end industrial facility to do a small run of fabric just to see what this stuff is capable with. But I just haven't been able to make those connections. I have plenty of other research topics I want to look into. There was actually a technical analysis of fiber characteristics done in parallel to this work by Clemson University, which I didn't find out until last year, actually. But what came out of that is they had my strain in a test with over 50 different strains of long staple cottons. They were trying to determine whether or not long staple cottons could be brought back to the Carolinas as a marketable crop. They were just really trying to get a baseline understanding of how they do in the area. But by some chance, they included the strain that I'm growing right here, and it had the longest staple by far. It was 10% longer than the next closest, 15% longer than average. It had the finest fiber, over 7% more fine, 23% finer than average. But it also had the worst yield, by 60% worse than average, 44% worse than the next worst. So that was a very humbling but also reassuring thing to learn, because I've had horrendous yields this entire time and I thought I was doing something wrong. But it turns out the scientists who do this stuff for a living are having the same problem. So there's just something wrong with this crop. And like I indicated before, this came from Bleak Hall. They were really known for the quality of their fiber, not their yield. So there's an inverse correlation in the cotton genome where fineness of fiber results in a loss of yield. So this is a further indication of the fact that this is probably directly from Bleak Hall because it has that same character of that crop that they would have grown for that highest quality. And so, conclusions, Sea Island cotton is extinct no more. It's being grown on Edisto Island and James Island. It's an integral part of our interpretation of Lowcountry history, and its cultivation comes with a unique host of challenges. And some final answers before we do the Q&A that I don't have time for is that this is not a business venture. I'm not marketing any projects. I'm not selling anything. I'm not selling lint. I'm not selling fiber. I'm not selling seeds. The USDA won't let me sell seeds unless I have a permit. They won't tell me how to get the permit. If you'd like to support the project, you can donate to the Project Land Trust. Please designate it to the tractor fund. I'm still doing everything by hand with a hoe. And with that, I'll leave you.